This is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. I hope you enjoyed this Critical Thought, your daily discussion on game design. Welcome to today's Critical Thought. As always, thank you to now 966 subscribers here on YouTube. For you first-timers, be sure to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the content. For today's Critical Thought, we are going to be turning to the topic of UI design. And this is one that we are not going to be getting done in one Critical Thought. And I'm sure if you have any suggestions, be sure to leave them below, because I have a few future ones I want to talk about. Before we get with that, I was thinking about that newspaper I showed in the previous Critical Thought with my mention in the paper. Maybe I'll add like a little collage behind me on that back wall there, just so there's something going on. But UI design is a major part of game development, and it is very understated in how important it is to making your game accessible and allowing it to even work in the first place. And like I said, there are different aspects and different kinds of philosophies when it comes to UI design. And we're not going to be getting through all of them in today's Critical Thought, that's for sure. For today's piece, I guess we should start at the beginning, or the most important part, and that is main screen, or the main screen of your game. When we talk about main screen UI design, we are talking about the screen that people are going to be looking at the most when playing your title. Whether it is the opening or the main screens of Dark Souls, your Empire view of Civilization, your solar system view of Stellaris, etc. This is a screen that the players are going to be looking at the most when they're playing. And that also means it is very important to get the UI just right. And UI design has elements of programming, design, and even art in some cases. When it comes to talking about building a good UI, the game itself is going to have an impact on this. Obviously, a game like Mario Brothers is going to need a far less complicated UI compared to a game like Civilization or Stellaris. But the general principles remain universal across games. When it comes to designing your main screen, you have to think in terms of what information is the player always going to need access to. And we can break down just about any game. If we look at any of the Souls game, for instance, the player needs to know what their health, magic, and stamina are. They need to know what their equipment they're currently wearing. They need to be able to cycle through items through the quick bar. And of course, obviously, they need to see the character themselves. Now, for UI design, we're going to most likely ignore talking about the player character themselves. They are definitely going to be featured on the screen, but we want to focus more on the UI, or the information being generated. And again, there's so many more topics we can bring up here. Now, when coming up with the main UI design, or I'm sorry, the main screen UI, there is that very careful balance between too much and too little information. Imagine, for instance, that my screen here, what you're seeing, is the main screen of a UI. Now, right now it's clean, but of course there's not a lot of information going on. But if, let's say, I start plastering stuff here, have like little numbers going all over here, have a logo over here, it's going to be harder to see, and more importantly, it's going to be harder to concentrate on the UI. One of the most important aspects of good UI design is that it shouldn't essentially overwhelm the player. With that said, of course, there's obviously the contradiction. What about grand strategy games like Stellaris, Civilization, Europa Universalis that have a lot of information to go over? And that's where things get tricky. Remember, the more information that's important or relevant, the more that needs to be shown. Now, there are several tips or several tricks as a designers you can use. There is an integrated UI, and there's dynamic UIs. But again, we may not have the time to dedicate to all of those. But when it comes to the main screen itself, it's important to go by whatever information the player will need to process what's going on at this very instance. For instance, in Civilization, the main screen will show you general statuses or general variables for how happy your people are, what's your current profit, the year that we're in, the age, what you're currently working on, what's currently being produced, stuff like that. Now, the latest Civilization, Civ 6, which from what I've seen, it's one of those games I do have to play at some point, they went with a very much an integrated UI in the sense that everything that you see on the map is a good representation of what that is. For instance, if you see people working a farm, you know that you have a farm on that tile and there's a worker. If you have aqueducts, coliseums, military buildings, you name it, that's a good indication of what that civ is doing. And that's a major part of integrated UIs, that you're basically using what's in the game to represent how everything is going. A really good example of that would be many action games these days, instead of having a health bar, they let the screen show their health. And you can see this in just about any number of these titles. As a player gets hurt, you'll see like splots of blood, flash on the screen. Or maybe the screen will start to turn a different color or go pale. Or, septitone. And that's a way to indicate to the player that they're in danger without having a bar that shows up, that goes up and down, etc. As I said, when it comes to making an interesting, or more importantly, a detailed UI, you also have to balance not blocking information on the screen. If we have windows and health bars and numbers all flying up and down, it can be very hard to actually see what's going on the screen itself. This is why many games, especially older titles, use borders and framing in order to establish their UI. Anyone who's played an action game, especially during the NES era, will know how there is usually like a border like this, and that up here is all the UI information, down here is all the gameplay elements. And it's important to establish essentially zones of information for the player to process. I remember reading one of my game design books from back in the day, and I have a small collection of them downstairs. And one of the important rules was, even if you don't have the information, it's more pleasing to the eye to properly frame things rather than letting them float in the ether in a sense. What I mean by that is, let's go back to this border example here, which if I can get my fingers just right, one of these days I will get this straightened out. There you go. So let's say this is the border. Now, even though, let's say I only have information that comes up to here, even if I don't have any more information to fill that border, I should still keep that border extended to the two extremes, or the two ends of the screen, because it will frame that easier, and it just looks aesthetically more pleasing rather than just having borders that maybe come to here, or having something like stops like midway through, elements like that. As a really interesting case in point, and one that I'm surprised more people didn't talk about, Odallus the Dark Call had a really great UI that I don't think anyone else has copied. What they did was they did the framing thing like you would in a normal game, but instead of tying it to like a bar at the top or a bar at the bottom, they framed it like this. So you have on either side of my hands, that's a UI information. And then in the middle here is the actual game screen. And while it doesn't sound all that impressive, what it did essentially was allow you to process the UI elements around without having to shift your focus up or down. Because you're staring straight ahead, you're going to see the information over here naturally. And even though you had technically less real estate from the main game screen, because again it was this, it was still easier to process. And with UIs, it's also important to understand the difference between, or the separating numbers from symbols. This is one of those very tricky, and it could even be a philosophical discussion regarding how to properly represent information. As you know, older games will use, hearts, life pips, any kind of symbols you can think of. And there's that debate as to whether more numbers would be better or would symbols work. In Civilization, I want to say 5 or 4, Instead of showing like a complex number for how happiness is determined, they simply have the simple a symbol of a smiley face and then maybe like a number 2, 3, 4 next to it. Symbols are a very important part of effective UI design because you can cram a lot of information into a symbol. You can have a symbol that represents if I'm being detected by an enemy, symbol that shows if I'm being poisoned, burned, frozen, you name it, any kind of status effect. You can have symbols to represent the different kinds of gear, and it becomes easier to process information when you're looking at these symbols. Numbers are also very important, but you have to be careful not to overload things. One of the biggest points about how video games became standardized was reducing the amount of information the player was going to get. You can see the difference in this with the older dungeon crawlers or D&D based CRPGs versus modern day ones. Many older CRPGs throw the entire formulas on the screen in the UI. So it's not just saying, this weapon will do 5 damage. It'll say this weapon does, 2d4 and will be based off of this percent based on your character's attack, perception, the other character's armor rating, and it gave you a lot of information, which is good for players who are experts at the game, but it becomes harder to process things when all you're seeing are numbers and equations. Because things were streamlined over the last decade, it's become a lot easier to show relevant information. And again, that's kind of the main point for today's critical thought. You always want the player to see what's relevant to the current situation. Again, there are advanced examples with dynamic UIs, but we are going to be running out of time soon, and again, there'll be more topics regarding UI design here. But when it comes to understanding what the player is considered relevant, again, it just goes back with playing the game. Your main screen should show the player everything they need to, and with rare exception, they should not be switching off of the main screen. Now, again, there are exceptions when we're talking about grand strategy games, when you just literally can't fit everything on there. But I should be able to look at the main screen of your game and be able to make a reasonable estimate about what's going on, what should I be doing, and what is this situation that I'm trying to get around. If I have every additional layer or window or UI panel, is going to make it harder to understand. The one giant no-no when it comes to UI design, you should never have to switch between multiple screens or multiple panels in order to get a single piece of information. For instance, let's say I'm equipping gear onto my character in an RPG. I shouldn't have to go from the equip screen to the item screen to then a status screen to see what my stats are when I'm wearing this gear. Again, flip-flopping between screens is just not a good example of UI. And even in the most complicated games, you want to avoid doing that. Now, we're going to wrap things up here. Like I said at the start, if there's any specific topics regarding UI design you'd like me to touch on, leave them in the comments below. Like I said, I will be revisiting this topic probably quite a bit here on the Critical Thoughts. I really want to talk about maybe either an integrated UI or a dynamic UI next, because they're both pretty much high-level or masterclass examples of UI design. But to sum things up, as you're building the UI for your game, again, think in terms of framing information, even if there is no literal frame, as in an actual border around your screen. It can be as simple as saying, if I'm going to have my health bar right here, then I should have any more information maybe down here along the same alignment. Even if you aren't going to put borders in, you can create a pseudo frame by how information is framed around the screen. Again, when you're coming up with the placements, you don't obviously want to be blocking the main character. I don't want to have to, if I'm playing a game, I shouldn't have my health bar or my currency blocking what I'm trying to shoot or what I'm trying to jump to. And again, when you're figuring out the relevancy, Again, this is simply going to come down to both your understanding as a designer and play testing the hell out of your game, and of course getting other people to look at it. Now, again, there is more to talk about with UI design. We may even get into the topics of colors. Yes, there is a discussion about what colors you should use for your UI elements. More with symbols, numbers, again, dynamic, integrated UIs, etc. And even, as I said earlier, regarding having multiple panels and multiple windows, there's one last thing I want to touch on there, even though this will probably be saved for another critical thought. It is important, or I'm sorry, it is acceptable to repeat information. Again, as long as it's relevant to what the player is looking at, you can show information that's on the main screen somewhere else. In fact, the game is better for it. For instance, like I said with like a civilization, for example, the main screen UI will have a little ring that shows what my currency is. And if I mouse over it, it will bring up the tooltip. And I'm sorry, I completely forgot. Tooltips are a major part of UI design. And again, way too much to get into now, so we're approaching 16 minutes. But with the civilization, for example, that currency reading, if I go to my economics window or my government or whatever, it will show relevant information there. If I go to what my trading is, it will show me how much money I'm making from trade, where those resources are coming from. Again, the less the player has to hunt down information they need, the better your game's going to be for it. And like I said, there is a lot to unpack here, and that's because it is a very complicated topic. And you can tell the difference between a good UI and a bad UI, and this will be my final note. The ultimate sign that you have a great UI is if the people don't even notice it. It's such an integrated or well-thought experience that it becomes second nature almost immediately. It goes back to a older concept of flow with controllers, that if your control scheme is so good while you're playing it, you will never have to look down at the controller to know what the buttons are. It all becomes essentially muscle memory, and you build the schema to use it. But let's wrap it up here before we get into critical thoughts 2 and 3 and 4 for today. So once again, thank you so much for watching. If you're enjoying things, be sure to like and subscribe. We are getting up there to 1,000, and it should be happening any day, especially if you folks keep enjoying the content here. Once again, I'm Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com, where we examine the art and science of games. Thanks again for tuning in today's Critical Thought. Be sure to check back tomorrow for more great content here and on GameWisdom.com. Take care. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoy it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends. It always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GWBycer for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.